Okay, thanks for everyone who's joined so far. We are actually waiting on two potential panelists, one being Joshua Landis, who's running a couple minutes late, and the other is someone who may join, who is from the U.S. mission of the Syrian Democratic Council. So that's the Kurdish political mission from the Northeast. They may join, they may not be able to join. As you can imagine, they have a lot going on right now. But Josh should be joining in a couple minutes. With that, I'm going to introduce the panel. And if you're not familiar with the Quincy Institute, the Quincy Institute is a think tank based in Washington, D.C., that advocates for a more restraint-oriented U.S. foreign policy rooted in diplomacy rather than foreign military interventions. And today we're talking about Syria and the United States after Assad. And we have a great lineup. We have our own Stephen Simon, who's a senior research fellow at the Quincy Institute and has significant experience in government. From 2011 to 2012, he served as the National Security Council on the National Security Council as senior director for Middle Eastern and North African affairs, and of course worked directly on Syria issues, especially during those years. And he also worked on the NSC staff from 1994 to 1999 during the Clinton administration on counterterrorism and Middle East security policy. And his most recent book, Grand Delusion: The Rise and Fall of American Ambition in the Middle East, was published last year. Josh Landis, who should be joining as a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute and the Sandra Mackey Chair and Professor of Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma. And he's the director of the Center for Middle East Studies there. And of course, he's written extensively on Syria for decades now. We also have Carolyn Rose, who's the director of the Strategic Blind Spots portfolio at the New Lines Institute, where she leads research on various topics, but she has particularly focused on the captagon trade, which was, of course, a drug trade emanating from Syria and a bit understudied, but very significant to the war there and potentially to the aftermath of the war. My name's Adam Weinstein, if you don't know, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Middle East Program here at the Quincy Institute. And if our Syrian colleague joins, I'll introduce her then. Um, while we're waiting, I think we'll just get started with questions. I'm sorry that not everyone is here yet. Uh, but I'll start with you, Steve. Were you surprised by the events of the last 10 days, by the HTS siege of Aleppo, and then uh, the potentially brokered surrender of Assad, in which he evacuated to Russia, and then the this well, I don't even know if we can call it a siege. The HTS just walked into Damascus. Were you surprised by those events?
Yeah, I guess I was. No, I think the phrase I think people use is shocked but not surprised. If you can parse that, it was one of those things that one doesn't expect really because typically one looks at Syria as a kind of a steady state, you know, and this is one of the reasons why the Civil War surprised people way back when in 2011, and it's the reason why people are kind of surprised by what's going on in Syria now. It tends to escape people's attention for various reasons, and also as Bob Jervis, the late and very distinguished international relations scholar, used to say, nothing is more surprising than a coup. It's extremely difficult to predict, and in a way, this was a coup, a kind of a Turkish-inspired a coup. So the short answer is kind of yes, but. You're muted.
Like I said, 4 years beyond COVID, and I still forget to unmute myself. I don't know when I'll learn. But anyway, uh, another question I have is, just a little bit ago, Ministry of Interior of the new Syrian government released a photo with Turkish Foreign Minister Fidan, and in that tweet they announced that there was a Turkish Qatari delegation that had arrived in Damascus, including Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan and others as well, and they were meeting with the new government, including the new prime minister. And interestingly enough, and maybe I'm overreading into this, in the photo they just show the Turkish flag. They don't show the Qatari flag, and the focus is on Fidan. And I found the optics of that a bit interesting, which leads me to the question: who is running Syria? Is it HTS or is it Turkey or is it something in between?
Is that question for me?
That's for you, Steve.
Yeah, okay. So my inclination is to see this as essentially a Turkish coup. Now the Turks and the Qataris have been have constituted an axis since the early days of the Syrian civil war, lo those many years ago, and they finally reached their objective. They're ideologically aligned, their foreign policies are aligned, and their goals vis-a-vis Syria, in particular, are aligned. So I'm not at all surprised to see that, of course. But the Turks have several objectives vis-a-vis Syria that are met by their um, uh, sponsored incursion and conquest of Syria by HTS and a congeries of Sunni militias that are backed by Turkey. First, Turkey has long sought a buffer zone within Syria. That's an effort that's ongoing for a while and that has already achieved a lot of its objectives. They are very concerned to put pressure, if not completely to subjugate Syrian Kurds, because the gains that they've made towards autonomy within the Syrian context, the Turks find, threatening for their domestic situation and domestic relations with the Kurds. So there's that. Erdogan himself developed quite a serious antipathy to Assad and was, very eager to see Assad gone. And Erdogan himself is ideologically, if I can put it that way, aligned with HTS. The Turks had sponsored the HTS kind of mini caliphate in Idlib governorate in Syria. They provided protection for it, they provided money for it, and so forth. And of course, the Turks are swimming in Syrian refugees, which I think that they'd like to see repatriated to Syria, and that was also not going to happen as long as Assad was in power. So the Turks were over incentivized. Now, lately, there's been one other wrinkle, which as you know, I've got my eye on, which is how the Turks posture in Syria against Israel. The Turkish-Israeli relations have taken a real dive. They're very tense. Erdogan has spoken in, fairly hostile, even aggressive terms about Israel in consequence of Israeli actions in the context of the Gaza war. Um, uh, and and he might be looking at Syria as a place where he could deploy his forces closer to Israel's border and exert some real practical pressure. So I think the incentives on the Turkish side were overdetermined. I mean, there were so many of them. Any two of them would have been enough to parlay Turkish sponsorship of HTS in Idlib into a smash and grab and ultimately a successful coup in Syria.
And of course, I'm sure that Bashar Assad is regretting not laying siege to Idlib when he had the opportunity. But of course, his hands were tied by Russia, and that was partly due to negotiations between Turkey and Russia. And part of the reason that the Turks didn't want a siege of Idlib, there were many reasons, but one reason is they didn't want to see a new wave of Syrian refugees. We'll get to that later, and we'll talk about Israel. But speaking of Syrian Kurds, we are joined now by Sinam Shirkani, who's very busy right now and might have to leave at 30 after the hour or even before that. But I want to give her a chance to speak. She's the chief of mission for the U.S. mission of the Syrian Democratic Council. So she's a representative of the Syrian Democratic Council, and she's a diplomat of the Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria, and serves on the SDC Presidential Council. So she can correct me if I'm wrong, or if I've characterized this incorrectly, but more or less it's the political wing of the EDF. And you can read her extensive bio online. I want to give her a chance to speak. Sinam, are you with us?
Yes, I'm with you. Are you hearing me?
Yeah, we're hearing you, but we're not seeing you.
Okay, just let me open the camera.
So
Okay.
maybe in a couple minutes, you could give us, a lot of the attention has been on Aleppo and Damascus, and of course those areas are under control of the new government, but there's still an entire other part of Syria, northeastern Syria, that is under the control of the SDF, and of course there's U.S. troops there as well. So maybe you can give us your readout of what the situation is in northeastern Syria since the fall of Damascus.
Yes. Thank you so much for giving me the time. I will be leaving soon because I have another meeting, but it is an opportunity to clarify now the situation in northeast Syria. Since the collapse of al-Assad, which all the Syrian people, we're happy to see him collapsing after 50 years of tyranny and, suffering the people, Syrian people. But now after the collapsing of Assad, what post-Assad? What do we need as the Syrian people in Syria to seize the new Syria? Do we need to see Syria as an Islamic jihadist ruled by them, as Taliban, whatever, Afghanistan? This is what we are concerned about. Or do we want Syria to be a secular Syria, civilized Syria, with all the Syrian ethnic minorities being in the government? So regarding this issue, as soon as the HTS started to enter Aleppo, the National Syrian Army, backed by Turkey, they moved immediately to our region where we have the displaced people of Afrin, Kurdish people of Afrin, who has been displaced by Turkey in 2018 when they occupied the city. More than 150,000 of the displaced people, Kurdish people in the Shahba and Tel Rifat. They have been there for 6 years in the camps. SNA, backed by Turkey, immediately attacked these people. They committed a lot of atrocities, killing the people, Kurdish people, beheading a woman, Kurdish woman in Tel Rifat, and starting to rob their things and provocate them. But so for that, we wanted to evacuate our people to the northeast Syria to keep them safe. This is what we did. So we could evacuate 120,000 of the people to come to the northeast Syria. Still, we have about 15,000 missing. Don't know what happened to them, either being kidnapped or killed. Nobody knows about. Some family are missing. Now we have in the northeast Syria now a catastrophe, humanitarian issues for these people to keep them safe, warm, and provide them with all the assistance. The other things now, as soon as it happened now, the SNA started to attack the Manbij city. Manbij city, it has been liberated by our forces, Syrian Democratic Forces, in 2016 from ISIS. We liberated the city, and I can tell here the city majority are Arabs, not Kurds. Even though the Kurds or the Arabs, both of them, they shed blood to liberate their city from ISIS. SNA, they backed by Turkey, they attacked the city, and they want to take it back. So what happened? After many days of fighting with them, the Americans, they mediate with the Americans and with the global coalition, to mediate between us and them to have a ceasefire. We respect that. We had a ceasefire in Manbij. We respect the agreement, and then they say, okay, as a goodwill intention from us, we are asking to handle over this city to the SNA. We did that. Now Manbij completely has gone to the SNA by the agreement in order to have a ceasefire. But unfortunately, this group, they did not committed to the ceasefire agreement. Again, started to attack the Kobani city. Kobani city, which is the first city, witnessed the end of ISIS, the beginning of the end of ISIS when they defeated in Kobani. Again, we have the American, they also interfered and mediated between them to have some ceasefire. Now it's stopped a little bit, but they are now attacking the dam, which is close to the Kobani, between Kobani and the other side of the river. The dam, it is called Tishrin Dam. Tishrin Dam, it is on the Euphrates rivers. This dam provides electricity and water to the many of in the northeast Syria and in Aleppo city. We are at the dam as the SDF to protect it, and these groups, they want to destroy the dam. So for that, we are trying now. There is a severe fighting on the dam now. We call the international community and the global coalition that mediated to have a ceasefire agreement. We tell them that these people, they are not committed to the ceasefire agreement. So again, they say, okay, let us have an agreement there to stop this, and we will give the dam for, a civilian to manage it. Still now, we don't know. We didn't have still the agreement, but there is maybe, we always have the intention to end any bloodshed, Syrian bloodshed. This is what we want, because we want to end the bloodshed in order to build a new Syria now together. This is what's going on now. I will let you know, in the northeast Syria now, most of the people, they are worried. Kurdish people especially, they are worried because Turkey may attack our region. Christian people, they are under threat in the northeast Syria. And even the Alawite who are at the coast now, after the collapse of Assad, they are also afraid and very worried about some genocide or crimes will happen against them as they are Alawite from the HTS. Something happened in the coast. Yes, they killed some people in their homes. They killed many Alawite people. They are targeting them to their ethnicity. So this is the problem now. We hope that the HTS can move in a good way. They can work as a Syrian for all the ethnicities, all the minorities to be sharing in the government. What we have seen now, the new government, they have established a temporary government till March 25. It is only from their own people, from Idlib and from the HTS. No one from the other minorities, no Kurds, no Syriac, no Christian. That is not good. This is not a good sign for, the beginning of Syria or Syria, new Syria. So we hope that maybe we will have a better government, sharing power government with all the minorities, all the components in Syria. Syria is a diverse. We have to protect the diverse in Syria. We have to protect the minorities in Syria. We are really very concerned about our future as a Kurdish people, especially as a Christians, as Alawite, all of them, they are worried now. So is it now, can we see that Syria going toward Islamism, toward extremism? That will be a very bad sign. We don't want to see it. We hope that we will not see that. Till so far in Aleppo, we couldn't find any violation from HTS, but we have seen many members from HTS who are not Syrians. They are from Shashan, I don't know, from other countries. So we know that HTS, it has been designated as a terrorist group. The Jawlani, he was from Al-Qaeda, then Jabhat al-Nusra, and then he became HTS, and now he became the leader of Syria, That is the things we have to take it into consideration. We need now the United States to help the SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces, in order to be able to protect the people in Syria, the people, the minorities as the Kurd and the Arabs, even in the northeast Syria. All the Arabs, they want the SDF because they know how this Islamist group backed by Turkey, how they committed a lot of crimes. They don't want to see that. Some of the Arabs in Deir ez-Zor, they want to have HTS. We don't have any problem that we want to get a relation with the HTS now. We have some coordination in order to have, as they are de facto now a government there. So we need to reach them. We are, trying to reach them. We are trying to have a relation and to tell that we are a part of Syria. We have to be in this Syrian government and youth government. This is what we demand.
If I can interject for a moment, the Biden administration has stated that in order that it's open to recognizing the new government in Syria, but that an inclusive government would be part of that. Now, of course, HTS has made it these sort of public, very public olive branches to the Christian community and so forth, and they've used it to say they're more moderate, but they don't seem to have an inclusive government yet, although it's only been a few days. I have a follow-up question though for you because I know you have to drop off soon. You mentioned that some Arabs have left the SDF. Some people in the US think that the SDF is just Kurdish, but of course it does have Arab members. Some of them have left in Deir ez-Zor to become part of HTS. So I guess two questions. How worried are you about these defections? And then, do you think that the SDF is going to be able to potentially come to some kind of understanding both with Turkey and HTS? And in the case of SNA, which is even more controlled by Turkey, is there going to be any understanding there?
We wish to have, actually we call to have a dialogue with Turkey in order to end all this problem. Turkey always attacking us, calling or saying that we are bad Kurds. This is what we're accusing us. We are in Syria. We have been working since 2011. So till now, we are working for Syria as a country, liberated the Syrian territory. We paid 12,000 of our people to fight the ISIS. Most of them are Kurdish. Now, the SDF forces, it's Kurd and Arab majorities. So about maybe 50, 45, something like that, Arabs, or 50, sometimes they say, I don't know, exactly, but it is more than 40% of the Arabs in the SDF. So we are together, Arabs and Kurds. They were together to fight ISIS. So we need together also to protect our region. We need to have a dialogue with Turkey. Turkey is always accusing us being, bad Kurds or being a PKK, whatever. But we have in the region, Kurd, Arabs, Syria, Christian. When they are attacking this region, there is a genocide will happening for the Christian, for the Kurd again. The genocide would happen for the Christian people in 1915, it will be repeated again now. We know the Turk, how they think. So because of that, we don't want to have any genocide in the 21st century. We don't want to have any extremism in the 21st century. We need to have a dialogue with Turkey. We are open to that. And we asked the American, the government here, the Biden administration, to mediate between us and the Turkey to stop all the fighting and conflict between us. So far, we didn't find anything. We hope that to reach to any, agreement together, we need to stop any conflict in Syria in order to build our country together. This is what we hope, and this is what we ask also for.
Okay, well, I think that's a good note to end on. I know you have other meetings to attend to, so
yes.
Feel free to stay on as long as you want, but or drop off if you have to. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you. I have to leave now. Thank you so much for your, and thank you. Have a good day.
Carolyn, you've been quite patient, and I don't mean to jump around topics here, but of course, to really have a truly narratively coherent discussion about Syria, we would need 5 hours. So we are going to jump around topics a little bit because something that doesn't get discussed enough is the captagon trade that was fueling the war in Syria and perhaps might be used by non-state actors now that the Assad regime is gone. You've really built a niche specialty in this topic, and I know that New Lines published a very extensive report on captagon, and I know it's a topic that doesn't get much attention in the media, but is important to the U.S. government. So maybe you can briefly explain to listeners what the captagon trade is, how the Assad regime used it, and what might be the future of it, and then we might circle back to the Israel topic because I know that a lot of folks in the Q&A are asking about that.
Yeah, of course. And thanks so much for having me on to speak about this. We've seen actually captagon pop up quite frequently today and yesterday because there have been now a series of laboratory and warehouse seizures that expose the very close relationship that the regime had with captagon production and trafficking. So in a way, it's kind of nice to see some of these new videos and footage that confirm that what we've been researching for a very long time is in fact the case. And the relationship is in fact just as strong as our project and many other investigative researchers and journalists have been saying for years. So just to talk about captagon and to explain what drug this is, because it really is not a very popular substance outside of the Middle East. Captagon is an amphetamine type stimulant, an ATS, that was established as a licit pharmaceutical product in the 1960s. It had a very brief tenure in the licit market until the mid-1980s, until the World Health Organization began to schedule the drug. And it then, of course, trickled into the illicit market, first starting out as an illicit underground drug in the 1990s to early 2000s in the Balkans. And then slowly it made its way to the Levant, to Lebanon, and then into Syria. It had a brief stint in Turkey where there were some small-scale labs. Throughout the early 2000s, captagon production was very small scale. I mean, you would find this stuff being made in someone's basement. It was, it was very little and very easy to make. Very little scientific know-how was required for captagon production. And so because of that, you would see, local traffickers or warlords or criminal networks engage in captagon production to diversify the different illicit products that they were either manufacturing or trafficking. Fast forward to the 2010s, captagon began to be almost exclusively associated with the Islamic State, something that wasn't necessarily entirely the case when it came to captagon inside of Syria. There were a few reports that ISIS fighters had taken captagon to conduct some operations. And because of that, there was a huge, I think, surge in media attention on captagon and how it was related to ISIS as a terrorist organization, when in fact, captagon actually as a whole was being produced in many more cases across the board, across Syria. Amongst warlords, members of the opposition, as well as terrorist organizations like ISIS. Additionally, captagon became a commodity to be taxed at checkpoints. That's when we really started to see Syria flourish at its peak and at the peak of the Syrian civil war as this checkpoint economy. Militias would impose taxes on trafficking organizations that were trying to shuffle captagon through and reach their destination markets. But at the end of the 2010s, that's when we started to see some interesting signs that captagon was exploding in the region. The demand markets were always the same. Gulf states that where there were many different communities that sought out captagon as a drug that would allow them to participate in recreational activities, as well as a drug that would bolster productivity. So you would have foreign worker populations that really sought out captagon to work second or third shifts or work long hours. University students that also sought out captagon to stay up late for exams and to study. as well as food insecure communities that sought out captagon to save meals or to stay up late to work. And ultimately in the late 2010s, the late 2010s and early 2020s, that's when we started to see captagon being shipped in huge sized consignments, often through maritime routes, on commercial shipping vessels, that made a lot of analysts like myself think twice about, okay, is this a trade that is exclusively associated with organizations like the Islamic State? And ultimately, the fact that captagon was being dispatched from ports like the port of Latakia, Tartus, and some very notable border crossings that often had either the exclusive or the majority of access from the regime, along with industrial scale packaging materials and capabilities that really only a state actor would have access to. That's really what started, I think, the journey for analysts and researchers like myself, as well as others at other organizations, to really embark and figure out what actors are behind the captagon trade. And we soon found in 2020, 2021, 2022, really at the peak of the captagon trade, that the 4th Armored Division, the Syrian Air Force Intelligence Directorate, the Military Intelligence Directorate, and many Assad family members like Wasim Badia al-Assad, Samer al-Assad, Munther al-Assad, plus regime allies and friends of Bashar, personal friends, people like Amer Kiti, Kodur Tahrir, Tahrir al-Kayali, they were all embedded in different phases of captagon production and or trafficking. They really allowed captagon to mushroom into an industrial scale trade that was, at least in 2022, estimated to be around $10 billion annually, accounting for both seized and unseized pills. So the pills that are being spotted, as well as the pills that are trickling through undetected by law enforcement. And by the end of 2023, there was an excellent study conducted by the Syrian Observatory for Political and Economics that estimated that captagon was worth at least $2.4 billion for just regime-aligned actors. What we know in terms of just how they were using this revenue, it's very clear that the revenue was not being trickled immediately back into the Syrian economy or public services. Instead, this was really lining the pockets of regime allies and, in some cases, regime officials that allowed them to essentially stay afloat amidst sanctions, amidst the war-torn economy, and allowed them to sustain the lifestyle that they had before the Syrian war. You saw many, cousins of Bashar al-Assad, driving extremely luxurious cars, throwing extravagant parties, and being able to travel to different places and enjoy a very comfortable, wealthy lifestyle. This also extended to many allies that they had in Lebanon, particularly those that either had allegiance or were directly affiliated with Hezbollah, that also perpetuated this trade and offered this outlet to Lebanese ports to help sustain the trade. Now, it's quite interesting because, our work over at the Captagon Trade Project at the New Lines Institute, we've been trying to track a lot of these laboratories, both large and small, and we had always pointed to Douma, Latakia, Damascus, Tartus, and in some cases some hotspots in Aleppo, as well as some small-scale laboratories in Dara and Sueda as some of the hotspots for captagon production. And then in recent days, we've seen now at least 2 large-scale captagon production facilities, as well as 2 to 3 different staging warehouse facilities storing captagon. And I want to add that these are the first captagon lab seizures that have been recorded in the history of Syria seizing captagon. For years, the regime did I would say, pretty comprehensive job of covering up production, denouncing that production was happening inside of regime-held territories, pointing fingers to the opposition, pointing fingers to other actors and its adversaries, saying that there was no manufacturing whatsoever inside of regime-held territories. And then, of course, as soon as Assad is on a plane to Moscow and the regime falls, we are already seeing extensive evidence of industrial scale production inside of hotspots like Douma, Latakia, and Damascus. And so I expect that more of these seizures will happen. In terms of looking ahead, I think that it's very clear that there's going to be a shortage in captagon supply, at least in the short term. When you look at some of these factories, I mean, it's incredible, the industrial scale manufacturing equipment that they had. There's going to be no actor that will be able to replace that immediately. But they have been preparing for this. We can see at least in 2022, 2023, and 2024, actors started to trickle out from Syria into places like Iraq, Turkey, Egypt, Kuwait even, and in some cases, Libya, Germany, and the Netherlands. And they've started to set up very small shops of captagon production facilities. And likely that's what we'll see in the coming years, in the coming months even. A lot of these actors try and get creative, establish different trafficking routes, different places for production. Additionally, and probably the most scary outcome that we'll likely see is the next step, and it's the next kind of door into another substance. And it's the question of what alternative substance could take the place of captagon. And the answer is methamphetamine. And we've already seen skyrocketing rates of crystal meth consumption in the Middle East, in places like Iraq, also in the Gulf, where it's commonly referred to as shabo. And likely the captagon shortage could create a greater demand for crystal methamphetamine and methamphetamine tablets. So that is something.
Not to cut you off, but do you see, I mean, obviously the Assad regime was using it to, at least to insulate their lifestyle and to some, to some extent be able to fund certain activities. And of course, the Assad regime was extremely sanctioned, but as Syria was sanctioned. And of course, HTS is an FTO, a designated foreign terrorist organization. Jawlani himself is designated as a global terrorist. Obviously, certain regional countries are moving to accept the reality of the new Syria, and perhaps the U.S. government will look the other way in the name of stability. But maybe we can talk to Steve about that. But if they don't look the other way and Syria remains extremely sanctioned and the integration into the region economically is slow, I mean, do you foresee HTS somewhat relying on captagon to stay afloat?
I could see to a degree, and I think what we've seen thus far with HTS, if you just look at Idlib as a case study, the name of the game there had been taxation. It's a checkpoint economy. You're taxing a lot of the illicit substances that were flowing through. Although in recent years, I will say HTS did, I would say they did a very intentional job of trying to disclose and seize captagon shipments that were coming through, as well as methamphetamine, hashish shipments that were flowing through the Northwest, as a way, a rhetorical tool to point fingers at the regime and create kind of this moral high ground. Likely what would continue if there is a need for alternative revenue streams. I think that we could see low-level captagon production continue in Syria, and then likely the taxation of captagon through, border checkpoints and whatnot. But now that we're seeing the dismantling and the disassembling of some of these major captagon factories and warehouses, and the fact that Jawlani also in this victory speech that he made recently, just a few days ago, he talked about captagon. He also talked very briefly about cleansing Syria of this image that and this association it had with illicit drugs. I see, at least as HTS is trying to do this makeover of, and it's kind of a makeover of moderation, I could see them trying to put an arm's length between them and the illicit drug industry in Syria. Of course, this could be something that could be overturned very quickly, but likely I think that they will at least try and keep production of captagon at an arm's length, whereas they might tax and may not necessarily intervene with low-level, small-scale captagon producers that are not associated with governance in Syria. These might be just warlords that are operating in the south, and then they essentially just tax for just a little bit of extra cash on the top.
Okay, well that's very interesting. I wanted to feature that because it's an underreported story in the Syrian civil war, but in some ways how some of the events were being funded. I'm going to circle back now to Stephen. We have a bunch of questions in the chat about Israel, and you were getting to that earlier, particularly about the strikes that we've seen uh, Israel conduct in the last few days. What is that all about, Steve? You're on mute.
I think it's primarily about disarming the new regime. Um, the over the course of the I don't know half a century that Syria was at war with Israel, and vice versa, I guess. The Syrians stockpiled an enormous amount of heavy weaponry and munitions, and these would have constituted Assad's unintended legacy or bequest to the successor government. And the Israelis wanted to deprive the new government of this legacy. The Israelis were also concerned to destroy the research institutes that operated under the Ministry of Defense in the Ministry of Defense in Syria, um, because it's where the Syrians developed, perfected, and fabricated um, the precursors to the nerve gases and other very toxic substances that it had weaponized as Syria's strategic response to Israel's possession of nuclear weapons. Many of these stockpiles of sarin and other toxic substances were destroyed in the wake of the 2013 chemical weapons attacks in the suburbs of Damascus, uh, under an agreement implemented by the UN, but reached initially between the United States, Russia, and the Assad regime. So I don't think that there's a lot of these substances left, but the Israelis, I think, wanted to level the infrastructure from which those substances had emerged to begin with. So they've done that, as well now. They may have other targets of which I'm unaware, but the overall objective is to ensure that if the new regime fields an army, it's not going to start out with a lot of tanks and artillery and mobility assets that would enable it to attack Israel with any effectiveness.
Yeah, of course. His nom de guerre, Golani is in the Golan Heights, and he has family links there. And now he's on video, basically saying all the right things that the Syrian people are done with war. He doesn't want to start a new war. His only enemies are Hezbollah and Iran. And in some sense, this must be music to the Israelis' ears. But you know, I suspect they don't trust it all that much. But why did they allow the Assad regime to keep the pilot light on this industrial base and this ability to produce chemical weapons and heavy weapons? I mean, surely they could have conducted these strikes on the Assad regime, but we've discussed this before, and it seems that what they really wanted was a weak Syria.
Well, to be sure, the Israelis favor a weak and divided Syria on their border. There's little question about that. But they also, in the case of the Assad regime, had concluded that that Assad was a kind of loyal opposition, and not a red meat eating, fierce, implacable enemy of Israel in a way that would lead to serious aggression, the use of chemical weapons, and all that kind of thing. Um, in essence, the Israelis had concluded that with respect to Syria, deterrence worked. That, Assad understood what the penalties would be if he got out of line, and therefore he avoided getting out of line. And as long as Assad was in power, in any case, he concentrated the bulk of his forces, his military capacity, around Damascus itself. This is what dictators do. The army becomes more of a Praetorian Guard or a regime survival tool than than it than it is a tool for power projection across the borders of the country. So you have a big army, but it's mostly Assad's bodyguard. The Israelis, I think, understood this, and in any case, the Israelis had a lot of other targets to strike, over the past 10 years or so, and these constituted primarily Iranian assets or the assets of Iranian proxies or convoys attempting to bring weapons, particularly rockets and missiles, across the Syrian border into Lebanon to buttress the arsenal of Lebanese Hezbollah. So I wouldn't, for a moment minimize the operational tempo of Israeli strikes against, Syrian targets while Assad was in power. Essentially, Syrian airspace was a free fire zone, for years for the Israelis, and they made enthusiastic use of that. But now, they're looking at their strikes have a somewhat different purpose than they did then.
And Carolyn, you had a tweet the other day saying something similar. Prime Minister Netanyahu had made a statement. If the new regime in Syria allows Iran to reestablish itself or allows the transfer of Iranian weapons to Hezbollah, we will respond forcefully and we will exact a heavy price. Of course, it's interesting that he's tying it to Iran and Hezbollah, since uh, it's a little bit laughable that Jolani would be friendly to them, and you wrote essentially, what in shorter form, what Steve just said is that it wants to ensure that Syria remains weak and to hamper the transitional government from functioning effectively or having too high of an operational capacity militarily. But I'm curious, do you have any thoughts beyond that, or on why in his comms Netanyahu is talking about Iran and Hezbollah when this sort of seems detached from the reality on the ground?
Well, yeah, I think that ultimately this really draws to the question of really what we've all been asking since the outbreak of this offensive after October 7th, which is, what's the end goal here? And I think that Israel has established this line of, look, we're seeking to target and essentially disable Iran's proxy network in the Middle East. And as I think repetitively, as we've seen the opening and the closing, or at least closing of halfway of these new fronts that have now been added in Lebanon, to a degree in the West Bank, and now in Syria, there's this question of, okay, if it is about Iran, and Iran aligned militias, then why, after we've seen really a massive exodus of Iran-aligned proxy networks, of course, there are still that remain inside of Syria, but still, after we've seen this influx of them back into Iraq, particularly aligned with Hashid militia networks, along with the regime, the 4th Armored Division, many of those individuals and those networks have reportedly departed Syria. Then why are we seeing the systematic bombardment of Syria's conventional military capabilities, its naval fleet, its air bases, its chemical weapons stockpiles? And ultimately, what that says to me, it's not necessarily about Iranian access to the Mediterranean. It's not about, the land bridge or the Shiite crescent or any of the other names that we've given to Iran's proxy strategy in the Levant. But really, it's a bit more towards, and it points to the fact that Israel's objective here is to try and dampen and to try and put more obstacles in this new transitional government's way when it comes to trying to challenge Israel or potentially create new, obstacles for Israeli forces, as well as, of course, try and commandeer additional territorial acquisitions beyond the Golan Heights. I think this is also about creating a larger buffer and having that as leverage against any new potential Syrian government. So I think that this is about a strategy of weakening Syria, just like it's a strategy of weakening Lebanon. And likely, if there's ever going to be an engagement with Iraq, I think that will also be the same strategy as well.
So, Steve, we've talked about the Israeli military's campaign objectives in Syria. Let's move on in the last 8 minutes to the U.S. military's objectives. Now, we heard from Sinam, which of course she has a particular view of things due to her relationship to the SDF, and the Turks have their own view. For those of you listening now, we will have a panel on Monday at 12 p.m. That talks about the Turkish perspective and features Gönül Tuğ, who wrote Erdogan's War, which is one of the best books on Erdogan's view of Syria I've read. And then we'll also have Colonel Rich Utsun, who I think has a lot of experience with the SDF, and of course Kadir Ustun from SEDA, who will be able to provide or Turkey's more official perspective, I think. So we'll hear from the Turkish perspective, and it will, in some ways, perhaps be a response to some of Sinam's points, although she won't be on that panel. But what's the American perspective on northeastern Syria and objectives in Syria, Steve? I mean, Jawlani had a bounty on his head, and yet he was operating freely in Idlib and giving talks at universities like he was a professor sometimes. And I suppose if the Americans had really wanted him dead, he would have been dead a long time ago. We still have 900 U.S. troops in northeastern Syria, purportedly there to fight ISIS, although maybe some of it was really about watching what the Iranians are doing. What is the future of the U.S. troops there? What are U.S. security priorities in Syria? What's going to happen to northeastern Syria? Are we going to be able to have better relations with Turkey, or is this SDF problem still going to be a thorn in the side of things? I know that's a lot of questions, but maybe you can give us a summary.
Well, I'm still reeling at the thought of professorial lectures constituting atrocities. Most of my students would probably agree, actually. Yeah, the United States had three objectives, maybe four, depending if you want to split hairs, by maintaining, a force of 900 soldiers and Marines in Syria. The stated version, the declaratory mission, was the defeat ISIS campaign. For that purpose, 900 uniformed personnel appropriately equipped were the disproportionate response to the fading threat of ISIS. So they kept their eye on things, and they backstopped the Kurds in terms of the Kurds' assumption of responsibility for security at the El Hol complex, which housed, thousands, continues to house thousands of former ISIS people, or maybe they're still ISIS people, and their families. So that was the stated intention, but there were several other objectives. The one to which you alluded was keeping an eye on Syria and actually keeping an eye on Iran and interdicting attempts by Iran to use the so-called land bridge, the land corridor across Syria to Lebanese Hezbollah for the purposes of the resupply of that organization from Iraq through the big border crossing points in southeastern Iraq, Atamf and Abu Kamal. So that was a second one. It was essentially to hamstring Iran, to put a spoke in the wheel of Iran's efforts in Lebanon and Syria. Now, thirdly, It was to protect the Kurds against the Turks. The Kurds, that is the SDF, had and continues to have. We'll see how this works out under Trump, but they have a strong base of support in Congress, particularly in the Senate. The Kurds are viewed as having been reliable allies, and we were shoulder to shoulder with the Kurds in combat. That's a big distinction for many in the United States. And therefore, Kurdish aspirations for autonomy and particularly to be fireproofed against Turkish aggression or Turkish attempts to subordinate Syrian Kurds struck quite a chord in Washington, particularly when Senator John McCain was still alive and in the Senate campaigning on behalf of the Kurds. So that's a big thing, and there was always tension in Washington between that objective and, of course, the U.S. treaty relations with the Turks. The Turks constitute the southern flank of NATO. Well, Turkey, Greece, and Italy, but the Turks are an important linchpin of it. So these objectives vis-a-vis the Kurds, the sentiments vis-a-vis the Kurds tended to clash with alliance commitments or tacit alliance obligations. You're an ally, to treaty ally with Turkey, you have to take their security interests seriously. Their security interests, they say are compromised by the Kurds. So, that puts different factions of the U.S. government or different impulses within the U.S. government in contestation. Okay, so that's another thing. If you talk to some of the diplomats from the first Trump administration who were in charge of Syria policy, they'll say, well, there was yet another related objective, which was to create a swamp in which the Russians would sink. So the United States would make the Russians' strategic commitment to Syria more difficult and more expensive to maintain. And by raising costs to the Russians, well, that would be a good thing just by definition, for the United States. So that's where those factors were motivating, America's now longstanding presence in Syria. There's a new pharaoh coming to town who knew not Joseph, and his name is Donald Trump. He has already said quite emphatically that the U.S. doesn't have a stake in Syria, and the 900 troops that are there now will be pulled out when he is president. Now, in his first term, he did try to pull troops out of Syria, but he didn't really retain a focus, and there was no coherent policy coordination process. So inertia ruled the day, and despite several attempts by Trump when he was president of the United States to get American troops out of Syria, he didn't succeed. I think he's particularly focused now, or at least for the moment, on this. So it may well happen. If that does, then I'll just wrap up really by saying if that happens, then in a way, the U.S. will have contributed to the unification of Syria because, the Turks and the HTS will not, they won't accept Kurdish autonomy. They just won't accept it. So the Kurds will be reabsorbed under HTS and Turkish authority within Syria, and the major division within Syria will then have been healed, arguably. That's how that goes down in Washington. really remains to be seen. And it's part and parcel of this larger question of how the Senate and the new Trump administration will interact. If you look at the negotiations that have been going on, if I can put them that way, the bargaining going on behind the scenes over Pete Hegseth's proposed nomination as Secretary of Defense, you can see that the old Senate resistance to certain administration priorities, like the security of the Kurds and the U.S. moral obligation to the Kurds, won't be, I'm trying to find the right words here, but won't be sustainable given sort of the new and in a sense unprecedented sway of the White House over the Senate that I think we'll see at least in the first few years of the Trump administration.
Well, we'll have to end it there. I suspect you're right about that analysis of how Trump's going to approach it. It will be of course, a violent reintegration of the country, I suspect. And we'll talk more about that on Monday at noon on the Turkey panel. By the way, we don't have a landing page yet for it, but next Thursday we're going to have a discussion between Steve Simon and Professor Omar Dahi, who's a professor of economics at Hampshire College, but focusing on the Middle East, and he grew up in Syria. So we'll have somewhat of a fireside chat about a reflection of the events in Syria, and I'm sure so many more things will have happened by Thursday, next Thursday, that there will be a lot more to discuss then. There's also a new short brief that we call a note that Steve Simon and Josh Landis. Josh Landis had something unexpected that prevented him from coming here, so I'm sorry for those who wanted to hear from him. But they just published a note together, and it's very readable. It's not very long. I recommend that everyone read it, and I think my colleague is hopefully going to put it in the chat. But with that being said, I want to yeah, it's in the chat now. I want to thank Carolyn and Steve, and despite that she's not here anymore, Sinam, for joining us today. This topic is so massive, we could talk about it for 5 hours. So hopefully what we were able to discuss was interesting to all the viewers, and I appreciate all the viewers who stayed on, especially over time. So please join on Monday and next Thursday if you can, and thanks for your time, everyone.